Welcome to Belonging at the Top, driving performance through people. The podcast where leadership gets real and people come first. Your hosts are Dr. Natalie Parks, psychologist, behavior analyst, best-selling author, and your go-to expert for dismantling systems of injustice while building equitable, high-performing teams. And Anthony Butler, leadership coach, thought leader, speaker, and master of helping leaders unlock their team's full potential, one breakthrough at a time. Together, they're here to tackle your toughest leadership challenges with just the right mix of science, strategy, and a sprinkle of humor. In today's episode, we're diving into the shift back to traditional workspaces and what that means for company culture, employee morale, and productivity.
Hi, everyone. Today, we are going back to Cali.
Yeah, I think you mean the office. Yeah. Especially if you work for the federal government.
Oh, yeah. So, as most of you know, the federal government announced that everyone is returning back to work within 30 days, I think, of the announcement. So we're less than 30 days out as we are recording this. Interestingly, though, it's not just the federal government. It may be that's what's biggest, especially in the U.S. right now. But according to the 2024 CEO Outlook, they found that 83% of global staff would return to work within the next 3 years. And that's up even from the 2023 poll that said 64% were projected to go back to work. So I think the writing's on the wall. I think we're returning to a time where working from home is for the few, and the in between, we are all probably going to be impacted in some way or another to returning to the office full time.
I totally agree. And I'll put myself out there. It's one of those things that I actually agree with for a variety of reasons. I know you and I both have been telling our clients to get prepared for it, especially when we're dealing with teams and groups, that it was a benefit, if there were any benefits of COVID, that a lot of people got to experience what it was like to be work hybrid or to work from home. But a lot of leaders are really focused on going back to pre-COVID work life. And that's going to start with either a full hard stop, come back into the office 5 days a week, or some type of hybrid situation if you're fully remote now. But I think people really should start bracing themselves and making those life changes they need to at home to be prepared to come back into the office. And especially for young folk who are coming into the workspace or to the workforce, that they should not, they went to school in a hybrid situation for either high school or college, but they need to be prepared to really be in the office moving forward, especially if they're graduating in the next 2 to 3 years. So I think I'm looking forward to our discussion today and figuring out what the impact is and how we can help leaders who are really tasked with setting the tone and culture of their environment, how they can navigate this while still being at least cognizant and aware of what their employees will have to go to if their organization is making the change to go back into the office.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think this will be an equally interesting discussion because I'm not sure I do agree 100% with it. So we have a little dissension between us, or disagreement, and hopefully that will make for a very interesting discussion. I think the first question that should be asked, and my guess is most employees will ask this of their leaders, is why are you doing this, right? Like, why do we have to come back? We, especially from the employee perspective, probably feel like things are going pretty well at home. Working remotely is fantastic. So what is your motivation? What is the cost benefit analysis that has occurred? Why are we being called back into the office?
Right. And I think that's a valid question too. Not only are the employees asking it, I think that as a leader, whether you're the CEO, the COO, or the manager of your division, you need to understand what the reason behind it is, because you're going to get the questions. And if you can't answer that in a succinct, concise way with some authority, and you're going to be blasted by your staff. So you really need to have that confidence to be able to answer the question. And some people are going to push back for data. So what the data is, what's the rationale, what's the impact on the company, and what led to this decision. I think the clearer you can make that communication, the best. I hope that organizations that are doing this have some type of of comms team or marketing team. So internally that messaging is consistent and that everybody can buy in. I think that'll be key. So I think it's coming up with the why and then figuring out how you communicate that to your staff is going to be critical.
Yeah, I think the other thing to think about is, especially if you are among the C-suite leaders, is understanding that you may have some leaders that are not in agreement with this. And so you also need to be really thoughtful and really deliberate about having conversations with those leaders first and help them to figure out how they can message to their reports, even if they don't 100% agree, or even if it does create a lot of hardship that they're going to have to problem solve as well. So top level leaders need to not just be super clear on their vision, but they also need to have really deliberate and thoughtful conversations and figure out how to get buy-in, figure out how to have the conversations, and even allow maybe some space for people to not agree while also jumping on ship and supporting the vision of the larger organization. And because it's going to be critical, those mid-level managers are going to make or break it. And so it's critical to make sure that they are on board with the messaging, that they can discuss the messaging and answer the questions to the same level that you would be able to.
Right. And if not, you can force the policy to go into effect, but you're going to have a very low morale in the workplace. So let's talk about some of the reasons why that we've seen that organizations are doing it. And I think probably the one that sticks out for us, since this is the Belonging at the Top podcast, is culture. Right. And this is probably the reason why I agree with it the most. I think it's hard to, especially with the new team. So it's different when COVID started. So let me go back a bit. When COVID started and we all went out of the office, there was you had existing teams. So there was already a cultural dynamic there so that you could still navigate that and work with that because you had a status quo. But as people left and folks were leaving, not coming back into the office or choosing us not to work during COVID because government programs and benefits made it beneficial for some not to. But when you have an existing team, it was different. But now that the teams are different, and I would argue that most teams are different, there's been some turnover in organizations. It is very difficult to establish a culture with somebody who you've only seen for a few hours a day on Zoom or on Teams or on any other type of virtual meeting space. So I think that's one of the main reasons why I think it's kind of critical, especially for team building and building culture and making sure people feel like they belong, is that you have that real-time in-person dynamic that you don't get with a virtual situation. So that's primarily the reason why I say that I saw this coming, especially if I'm a new leader. If I'm a new leader and I don't know the team I'm coming into, I need to see y'all. It's hard to manage an organization. If I'm a new executive director, I'm a new CEO, and I never see my people and did not know them previously, it's going to be hard to establish some type of team culture and make people feel like they have some psychological safety and sense of belonging if we don't have that in-person interaction. That's my take on it.
Yeah, well, and I definitely agree. I think it taps into the relationships that are built, right? And understanding that when we are all in the office together, it is easier for some, at least, to build those relationships. We see each other in passing. I can pop into your office. I can pop over to your workspace. I'm thinking of one situation in particular where there was a supervisor who was giving a lot of corrective feedback. And that supervisor didn't really have a relationship with the people they were supervising, right? It's a new person came in,
Right.
They were completely virtual. They never spent time in the office. The only meetings they have were like these very large team meetings with high level leadership. And so you miss out on all of the positive interactions and the neutral interactions that can offset this corrective feedback. So when you talk about kind of workplace morale and you talk about building a team culture, everyone started to hate this supervisor because the only interactions they had with them were very, very negative.
Right.
And so I agree with you to that. I might add that I think whether you are working remotely or in the office, you have to be deliberate about building those relationships, right? So you can't just bring everyone back into the office and be like, okay, here we are. All of a sudden we'll have a culture now. You have to be very
Right.
deliberate about that. And you have to plan out what you want your culture to be, what that looks like, and how it translates to the individual behaviors of every single person in the office. It's not kind of bringing people into the office is not the magic wand to improve your morale and culture.
Right. No, and I totally agree. And I think I've already had a client with a similar example where they forced everybody to come back in from fully remote to hybrid. That was the edict that went out. But within the first 2 weeks, nobody saw the CEO because he wasn't in the office. And so, although he had his reasons, it isn't a great way to initiate that policy when you won't be intentional about making sure those things are there. And that is a benefit. I think of that is that you can have those other developmental, both positive and negative interactions as well. Reminds me of the Key and Peele episode when people misread text messages. I don't know if you've seen it or not. Love Key and Peele. For those of you who haven't checked it, look it up on YouTube, Comedy Central. But really, and you probably have seen it yourself, how people imply tone in text messaging or imply tone if they can't see. There's a lot that goes on in communication that's nonverbal. So that was bad enough that folks would refuse to turn on their cameras on virtual meetings. So now you're speaking, but I can't see how you're responding to what I say because your camera's off, and vice versa. So I think those details and that ability to communicate effectively by reading the room, which you really can't do in a virtual setting. Right. So I think that you have to be in the room. So don't bring your team back and then feel like you're excluded because you're at the top, that you don't have to follow the same rules as everybody else. Because that's just going to it's not going to endear a team to you. It's going to create another level of friction and dissension because you're not being intentional about the process of bringing them back. So that's one reason, right? So culture, right? So we talk about culture, communication, being able to develop employees, making sure that folks feel belonging. What are some of the other reasons that you think that you've seen that CEOs are bringing folks back?
So I think another main reason is considering whether you call it cybersecurity or you call it utilization of networks outside of the office, right? And so one thing that we know is that it's much easier to keep everything secure when everything is on the exact same network, i.e. in one building together. And when you have multiple people working in multiple different locations, logging into Starbucks' Wi-Fi or logging into some other location's Wi-Fi that may or may not be secure, that may or may not have people who are hacking in. I know some of the larger organizations and the federal government, for example, you had to get approved where you were going to work. And so they tried to cut down on that by saying like, okay, you can only work in this one location. Right. And we did see though some of the complications and pitfalls of that is like, well, if my home internet goes out, then what do you do about that, right? And so the organization is now losing money left and right because people's internet, as we all know, drops no matter what carrier you're on. Right. And then here in St. Louis, we had some floods and things like that where people were displaced. And so your approved location is underwater, so you can't work there. But then people were trying to work other places, but they couldn't because it wasn't approved, right? And so now you have red tape that you have to figure out and the levels of approval of security that needed for the federal government, and I'm sure the larger organizations as well. And so bringing everyone back into the building eliminates all of those things, right? Eliminates the unproductivity that occurs when your internet drops. It eliminates the potential threats to your security of your data and other things that you're doing online. And I mean, just the level of equipment. So one conversation I had with someone who previously worked for the federal government, they posed the question of like, I wonder if they're going to take back all of their monitors and
hot
speakers.
Spots.
They had a whole setup that the government provided for them while they were at home.
Yep.
And that's a lot of additional money, right? And so the funny thing is that I think in the office, everyone is allowed one computer screen, whereas at home they were given two. So it will be interesting to see. The one recommendation that I maybe have is maybe provide your staff with the same level of technology that they had at home, so they don't feel like traveling into the office also results in a different or a lesser work environment.
No, I think that makes perfect sense because as leaders are walking around the buildings, I mean, it's very disheartening if you've got a 10-year lease that you signed in 2020, in January of 2020, and it's been empty for the past 5 years, that you're stuck, or you got to break the lease. And that there's a cost associated with an unoccupied office. But to your point, I think that's something that organizations need to be mindful of as well, is what are you doing to make that transition back into the office easier for your staff? How are you going to ease the pain, right? So what are we going to do? So one of them is making sure that your level of technology is going to be the same or better when you come into the office. I think that is critical, and it's not just a technology thing. Most people saw it as a raise that they didn't have to commute to work, especially if you're living the DMV. Your commute time to work could be 90 minutes to 2 hours, depending on where you live. And not just
Right.
because of distance, just because of traffic, just pure traffic. So not to mention the time, the cost associated with wear and tear in your car and gas or whatever your mass transit system is, and the stress of dealing with that traffic getting into the workplace. That's a cost that they didn't have to endure or didn't have to really incur when they were working from home. So I think it's probably a pro tip, right, or a practice tip, that if you are going to make folks come back into the office, offer something to ease that transition, even if it's not long term, but something that shows that, again, that you hear them, that you are aware, and you showing some grace, that you have your business reasons for bringing people back into the office because of culture, technology risk, real estate asset utilization. All that makes sense to me, but you still got to do it. Remember the human component. So if you're going to bring people back in, what does that look like for your staff? Are you offering, if you're in an area with good mass transit, are you buying monthly passes for your staff to come in so they don't have to drive in? Are you offering free parking? Is that an option? Are you doing flexible schedules, right? And it's pretty much known here in the DMV that anytime between 7 and 10, it's rush hour. You're going to be, it's going to take some time. So can you offer a flexible schedule where it's be in the office by 10, leave by 3 to balance what we know to be the peak rush hour periods here, and still have people in the office and accomplish those goals we have for the organization. So I think if employers and leaders need to really think about what are those things they can do to make that transition for their teams a bit easier, since you're making them come back into the office.
Right. I think the other thing I would throw out there to consider is family life and how family life will be impacted. So you talked about the time of the commute, not only as an expense, but people who have children who are in daycare or school. So while working from home, childcare looked different because most people's children are in school or childcare close to their living residence. And if they commute 30, 45 minutes to work, that may heavily impact childcare. Expenses may go up because now they need after-hour care where they didn't before.
Or before care, right? Depending on what time you have to be at work, you might need to drop off at a center before you go to work and have to go to the center after work. So
right. They may have to change daycares because their current daycare doesn't have before or after care. They might be in public school age kids. And so now they have to find somewhere for their children to go. And then you think about kind of nighttime routines. And so while those are all things outside of the work environment, I think we do need to understand that if you're adding on even 45 minutes, 30 minutes each way, that's adding on an hour to the workday. And that heavily impacts families, people who have younger children at home, even with the extent, like I know that I've been hybrid for a while. And when I used to have to driving home, it impacted kind of the schedule and dinner times and things like that. And so even though I didn't have to worry about childcare, it was like, well, now I'm home an hour later. So do my kids eat an hour later? Do I get fast food and feed them more unhealthy food as opposed to healthy foods? And so again, we have to go back to that why. Like, why is this so important? And not why is it important to you as a CEO? Why is it important for the organization, for the vision of the organization, for the vision of the position that the specific person is in? And then ease the pain. Other things are just as simple as like, can you put snacks in the office and drinks into the office and kind of make it okay, maybe I don't have to spend money on lunch now because I was eating lunch at home and that's a lot cheaper too. And now you have some refreshments or things like that in the office. And if you provide coffee, is it good coffee? Is it decent? Not that horrible office coffee, just things like that, I think would make a huge difference to people as they're transitioning.
Yep. And some people are just motivated by money. Tie the return to work to some type of compensation package, right? So if I am that employee who is either an empty nester or never had kids and I'm just everybody's favorite uncle, what do I get as compensation? A progressive organization might be able to have daycare on site or offer some type of stipends for daycare for anybody who has increased childcare needs because of their return to work, but that might not apply to everyone. So if there's a way to tie performance evaluations or your compensation to coming back into the office, I think that's a way too. I don't have any ideas on how to do that right now, but I think that helps with it. And the other thing I think of, and thinking again as a leader, if I'm a team leader or a supervisor, and we have a flexible schedule, and and I know my staff has younger children. If I say, great, you can come in at 10, I still need to know that person has probably been up since 6 a.m. dealing with kids, packing lunches, going to school, commuting to the office. So by the time you get to work, you've got 4 hours of life that's already beating down on you before you get into the office. And I'm asking you for your TPS reports. So I think and that's a reference to the movie Office Space. There will be a lot of pop culture references from me on this podcast. But yeah, you need to understand that when people are walking in, they've had to deal with life before they got into the office. And if now they have to readjust to that commute time and changes in their children's schedule, which has an effect on them and everybody's mental health at home, show some grace. Remember the human aspect when folks are coming back into the office.
Yeah. And I think that goes into kind of that second point, which we've been talking about, is how do we kind of ease that pain? And we've already talked about the commuting benefits, but also those alternative or flexible work schedules, right? And so is there any consideration that you could work from home, right? So I know one of the huge benefits that people have spoken about in working from home is that if they have a sick kid, then they can still work even though their child is, sleeping upstairs.
Right.
And if you don't have that flexibility, then now they're having to take a day off and they're having to use up their sick time or their leave time, whereas they didn't have to before. And so thinking about what is the impact of that, how does that translate? And is there a way that you can provide a little bit more flexibility in your work schedules and also expanding those leave policies in some sort of way?
And again, that to me, that's going back to my last comment about don't forget the humans that work with you. I think that flexibility is going to be required, especially if you're trying to build culture and make people feel like they belong and they have value to the organization. That you want to meet people where they are. You can't manage everybody the same way. You can have the same rules, but you have the flexibility in the rules and the policies that you can make concessions based on an individual situation, especially, again, if you value what they bring to the organization. So I think that's a fine line that you got to walk, because there's still employment laws we have to consider. You want to make sure you're not showing any bias or making any discriminatory decisions, but you still want to make human decisions that folks, again, feel like they are valued and that they contribute to the team, and that those concessions are made should reflect that. And I think that goes into, I think our last point we want to make for the session is that, you want to mind the culture, right? These are the intentional acts that you want to take as a leader to make sure that not just for return to the office. I think we'll say this several times, and we've said it before, is that as a leader, you've really got to take the lead on being the example and showing the way on what it means to create a culture of belonging in the workplace. Like, what is it that I can do as a leader to make people feel like they belong here and feel like they can contribute without fear of retribution. Those things don't go away when you're dealing with returning to the office. I think they become more critical at that point because now you've got, coming in, you've got an adversarial audience. They don't want to be there.
Right.
People want to be at home, get the kids off to school, log in and work and feel like they can do their job. And most people who work remote, I think, feel that way. That they felt productive. I think it's a rare scenario when people were taking advantage of the situation, especially now. It's been 5 years.
Right.
I think all the tricks, the mouth shakers and everything else, people have worked around that. We know who you are, and you didn't work well in a hybrid situation. So the people who are doing it now, who are still working hybrid and have been doing it for this long, have figured out how to do it and how to remain productive and show value to the organization. So although the organization's goals have changed, and now we want to see you in the office, don't forget those people that have been key to your organization. Still make them, appreciate their humanity, what they had going on in their personal life. But you've got to be the leader to do that. Whether you are a team leader, supervisor, director, and above, it's still upon you as a leader to make sure that you are setting that example. So be in the office. Don't be in your office, right? So you want to make sure that you don't just close your door and be locked in. So everybody's in the office and everything's are going fine. You need to spend some time outside your office door, in the cafeteria, in the break room, at the water machine, at the coffee station, whatever it is. Make sure that you are still giving some face time to the employees that you may come back into the office.
Yeah, I think being deliberate about interacting and interacting in the way that you want everyone else to interact with one another. I think about a time where I was a previous employer, I was lectured about not being in the office enough. And I was one of those resistant people that thought I was doing a great job at home. And I showed up when I needed to and interacted with people when it mattered. And I was told I was missing out on those hallway conversations or those water cooler conversations and building those relationships. And so I doubled my time in the office. And my supervisor would literally walk by my office to go talk to other people and not even pop their head in the door or say hello. And if I happened to catch them in the hall when I was going to fill my water bottle or go to the bathroom, it was a very quick hi and then on to other things. So my argument was my morale is probably much lower now because I am feeling actively excluded. Whereas when I was at home, I didn't have to see any of this, right? I wasn't excluded. And so I think when you think about the culture and figuring out a culture of belonging, understand there are going to be people there who still probably don't buy into the why.
Right.
And if they then feel excluded when they show up and much more excluded than they did when they were at home, they are not going to be there anymore very soon.
Right.
And so you don't want to create a situation where now people are exiting because they now are excluded when at home they actually felt pretty good about their job.
Right. And that's another pro tip. How do we expand our employee resource groups, especially in a time when employee resource groups are typically linked to DEI efforts? I don't think they have to be. They're not based on a protected class. So you can create resource groups like long distance commuters, like they either live out of state or they travel more than 50 miles into the office. That's a separate affinity group that you can still work with. It has nothing to do with, well, let me rephrase. I think it has everything to do with DEI, but not DEI under the pop culture sense with people who don't understand DEI. That's a whole other conversation or a podcast. But you can expand those employee resource groups, not run afoul of your organization's stance on DEI, but it really is a tool to make people feel like they belong and they are part of the culture and they are not ostracized. So if you've got three people or more who fit into a group, let them organize, let them go out and have a lunch and do whatever they want to do, but make it in a way that you support it, you recognize who they are, you see who they are. I think that's another way that when you are being led by your why and you provided some, I think that is an example of not only just minding the culture, but being intentional about the culture. And it's also a form of flexibility as well. If you're giving them some resources to kind of unite around that thing and figure out best practices for them so that they can show up to work, be appreciated at work, and be seen by their coworkers and receive that, what we hope is professional development that we said would happen if you came back into the office.
Right. So I think that summarizes all of our points about transitioning back to the office. As a quick summary, be in the office, not just your office, be out and about. Make sure you are behaving according to your why. So don't just talk your why, walk your why, live your why. Find out how to increase benefit of being in the office, whether that's through a better office setup, better technology, easier to do your job, snacks around the office, things like that. And then allow and support, maybe encourage and help create groups of like-minded people or people who have similar experiences, whether it's long-distance commuters or parents or introverts even. Allowing people to form a group and have a support network of people who are sharing similar experiences can really, really help your morale.
Yep, I think that's a great way to end it. Great summary. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
And remember, great leadership starts with belonging.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Belonging at the Top. We hope it sparked new ideas for fostering belonging in your leadership journey. If you found it insightful, please like and subscribe to our podcast for more thought-provoking discussions. We'd also love it if you could share it with others who might benefit from the conversation. If you have any feedback or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please email us or drop us a note on Instagram